Welcome to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. Sorry for that little interruption at the beginning. We've had that happen a couple times. We're working on that. You are watching what is arguably the best program on TV. Frankly Speaking, broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio. I'm your host, Frank Acom. We're going to get right to it because we have a couple special, we have one special guest today and one tomorrow, both on the same general topic, and that's the Supreme Court. Very timely. On today's show, we're going to be speaking with the Honorable Amul Tapar. Now, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Tapar, I believe it is. If you recall that name, it may spark memories. He was on the short list for the Supreme Court. He was, maybe if it wasn't Brett Kavanaugh, it'd be Judge Tapar. He's going to join us because he has a new book out called The People's Justice, Clarence Thomas and the Constitutional Stories That Define Him. If you are a fan, or even if you're not a fan of Clarence Thomas, I think you'll want to catch this interview because it's very interesting. We find out a little bit more about the man himself. In full disclosure, I did record it yesterday because of the judge's time frame and his schedule, and very interesting, very fascinating. And then on tomorrow's program, we're going to be talking with Robert Delahunty, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court. That's his new book. So we have back-to-back, today and tomorrow, Supreme Court, generally speaking, interviews. All right. So as always, you can contact me if you have any questions for me, comments, concerns, criticisms. Thank you to everybody who reaches out. I always appreciate it. Let's get to a quick story before we go to break. I'm going to have to cut a few of these segments a little bit short this morning because we want to have that full time with the judge coming up in just a moment. But you may have noticed the smoke in the air. So when we come back from this first break, we're going to talk about a warning from CNN, from specifically Julian Zelzer. He says the smoky air you're breathing is a warning sign. So we'll find out how we can fix it. Is your guess, is your prediction the government intervention? Well, you'll have to wait and see. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, stay with us. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio here on Marcus Street in Corning. Let's take a look at that warning from Julian Zelzer at CNN. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I don't think, first and foremost, when there's some issue going on, that, boy, I wish government could step in. Now, that's maybe not always the case, but there seems to be a certain side of things that tell you government is, well, to quote Ronald Reagan, government is the solution to our problem, right? That there's that mindset. But in Ronald Reagan's mindset, government is the problem. And so Julian Zelzer says, all that smoke in the air going on throughout the country, that the only real way to fix this problem is to have government get involved. Moments such as these require the government to take action to help protect Americans from the dangers of smog and other climate issues. So he's saying now that this is going on, some medical supplies that they have, the air quality tracking technology, which I think this is happening already. But this is the part that caught my attention. The only reason I mention it is, quote, but this moment also presents an important governing opportunity for elected officials who have struggled to build political support for bold climate change measures that would get to the root of some of these issues. I think if you've been paying attention to some of the legislation coming out of New York and even at the federal level, of course, if they're not bold actions such as banning you from having gas stoves, if that's not bold, we had the quote yesterday from John Kerry who said if you ride your bike everywhere, and you carpool to school and things like that, we're still not going to undo the damage that other countries are doing throughout the world in the name of global warming. And he mentions, again, this is Julian Zelzer, mentioning some of the ways that Joe Biden, this ends up becoming a very glowing piece on Joe Biden. President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act contains some of the most sweeping climate change measures that the nation has ever seen. So we have a lack of bold support for climate change measures. But then, in the next paragraph, we had some of the most sweeping climate change measures the nation has ever seen. At a time when we're talking about banning gas stoves, or we're talking about pizza ovens in New York City, I'm not really sure where the lack of support, at least from politically speaking, the lack of support for bold climate change, that theory from Mr. Zelzer comes from. So again, he mentions all the things that President Biden has done. He then kind of compares it to the civil rights movement. President John F. Kennedy, who resisted moving on civil rights legislation in the first 2 years of his presidency, finally sent a bill to Congress after activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. had exposed to the nation through protests what racism really looked like. So he compares the fight to do even more bold legislation. Again, it always goes back to the government. Government controlling what you do, what you eat, how you build your home, etc., or how you retrograde your home. Finally, millions of Americans are feeling the painful and immediate effects of environmental degradation. For too long, we've been sitting still. We can't afford to do so any longer. We can't afford. That's a tactic we see very often in politics, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste, essentially what this is. And we saw that from the very onset of the smoke coming in, that those in the media, those certain political parties saw an opportunity here to push, quote, bold measures against climate change. So just show you a little bit of a different mindset, that the government is always there to help things, make things better, where I think even in your day-to-day life, you may see that may not be the case, that the bureaucracy and the government does not always offer the solution. Again, to paraphrase President Reagan. We've got to take a short break, because when we come back, right back after this break, we're going to talk with the Honorable Amul Thapar. He was on the short list under President Trump to be on the Supreme Court. He's got that new book, The People's Justice, Clarence Thomas and the Constitutional Stories That Define Him. I think you're really going to enjoy this interview, so stay with us. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We've got our interview coming up in just a second. I had to go back to this article just real quickly, and then I wanted to highlight something else as well. But we were talking about the smoky air you're breathing is a warning sign, and that Julian Zelzer from CNN suggests that this is a time for government to really exploit this, if you want to call it a crisis, to put even more burdensome rules and laws on us, the individual, on businesses. Listen to the sentence right before the end, or this paragraph, maybe you could call it. Importantly, crises don't automatically translate into government action. This is where presidential leadership can matter. The smoke from wildfires enables leaders to connect the dots for voters. So, is that a polite way? Connect the dots for voters, to educate those rubes, those voting, the common man and woman. It's very condescending the way he puts that, to kind of dupe us. The smoke from wildfires enables leaders to connect the dots for voters. Well, thank you, Julian, and thank you to our elected officials on this. Doing so is not politicizing these situations. Again, that's in the same paragraph. Again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but doing so is not politicizing these situations. Isn't that exactly what you just said about connecting the dots to the voters? But rather exercising leadership to address the root causes of an issue. So it's leadership to put more rules and regulations on each of us for wildfires that, well, I'll ask you the question. The wildfires, they're suggesting that's a symptom of global warming. How did the wildfires start? Why is it necessarily due to global warming? I don't think I've seen that clearly laid out. But again, my thought on this is not to go directly for government help, because very often that just makes matters worse. One quick thing before we go to break. Don't forget, the Cardboard Boat Regatta starts here on Saturday. I hope that you'll watch it. We had Elisa Trosha on the program just the other day. She's going to be the host with me on the Cardboard Boat Regatta. It was fun. It's a good year, and Big Fox does such amazing work on this program. So please check it out. That's all the times that you can watch it. There you go. All right, we're going to take a break. Then our guest, the Honorable Amul Thapar, when we come back. So please stay with us. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom, and this is the MA Neal Financial Services section of our program. We're being joined by the author of The People's Justice, Clarence Thomas, and the constitutional stories that define him. Judge, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Frank. It's a lot of fun to be here.
Well, it's Clarence Thomas has always fascinated me, because the media since day one has always been in the attack mode. But what was it that made you decide now that you needed to write this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason I wanted to write the book is to correct the misperceptions about originalism and, in turn, Justice Thomas. The critics say it favors the rich over the poor, the strong over the weak, the corporations over the consumers. They call Justice Thomas an Uncle Tom and a traitor to his race. The stories of the cases prove the opposite is true. Not always. I'm not making the case that it always favors poor over rich or consumer over corporation. The case is actually that when you honor the original meaning of the Constitution, you honor what Justice Thomas calls the People's Constitution. And when you do so, it more often favors the little guy. Why? Because the Constitution is a limited agreement by the American people giving up and allowing the government to infringe upon some of their God-given rights in exchange for a limited federal government. But they retained everything else to themselves, and the Bill of Rights and other things make this clear. And Justice Thomas, by interpreting the people's Constitution, often protects the little guy. And so I think all the critics don't give him a fair shake.
Right.
And I think when your viewers read this book, what they'll find is, A, the stories of the real people in the case are captivating, and B, that it will give them ammunition to dispute all of those accounts.
I think the people that maybe are tuning in that aren't overly familiar with Clarence Thomas, just from what they've heard in the media, would think that he is heartless. That's why I think your book is an amazing way to disprove that.
Yeah, and in the introduction and conclusion, I tell you what I think. I tell you about his personal background, where he grew up dirt poor, raised by his grandfather because his mother couldn't afford to raise him, and how his grandfather saved every penny he had to send them to Catholic schools, segregated Catholic schools, so a young Justice Thomas could get an education. His grandfather believed, to quote Frederick Douglass, education means emancipation. And the irony of his grandfather talking about that is that it actually, Frederick Douglass often appears in Justice Thomas's opinions. The other thing about the heartless point, I start the book with a story, and all the cases are stories. Actually, they're real human drama, and that's what the reader will find. In the 12 chapters in between, I just lay out the cases, I lay out the facts, I source the material, I let your readers conclude, your viewers and ultimately readers conclude for themselves. The introduction and the conclusion, I talk about the first story. The book opens with, would you mind if I recounted it?
No, I would love that, yes.
Because I think it disproves this narrative. So Justice Thomas is a daily Mass participant, and he's walking out of Mass one day with a few of his law clerks who chose to go with him. And a homeless man comes running up to him, and he says, "Justice, Justice, I have a petition for you." And the clerks brace.
Yeah.
They reach to protect the justice, and the justice waves them off. And he walks over to this homeless man, and they can see they're engaged in a conversation. The homeless man's somewhat animated. The justice comes back, and they walk back to the Supreme Court. And the clerks say to him, "Justice, what was that about?" And he says, "These are tough days for him." And they look at the justice perplexingly. And the justice says to them, "You know, he used to be addicted to drugs. And as a result of that addiction, he had a falling out with his mother. I worked with him and counseled him on getting clean. And once he got clean, about 2 years ago, he reconciled with his mother. Sadly, his mother just passed away." and he wanted to talk to me about it.
Wow.
That's the type of man he is. I've seen firsthand when we went to an event at Yale Law School. This is not in the book, so it's exclusive, right?
Okay.
I went to an event, I have talked about it before, but I went to an event at Yale Law School, and they were, believe it or not, the Yale Law School was honoring him for 25 years on the bench.
Wow.
Yes, you heard that correctly. And when he was done, they had a reception for him. And at the reception were all these professors, many of whom are his critics, but just wanted a few minutes of his time.
Of course.
Or the students, also some of whom are critics, just wanted a few minutes of the justice's time. In the hour-long reception, he spent 30 minutes talking to the support staff. When it was done, we had to escort him to dinner. We were 30 minutes late for dinner because the justice would not leave until every person there who wanted it got a picture with him, an individual picture.
Wow.
And he talked to everyone, and we're like, Justice, we're late for dinner. He's like, no, I'm going to do this. Every event he goes to, he stays after and thanks every one of the support staff. He'll go into the kitchen and thank the people who made his food. This is a man that loves people, so much so that Justice Sotomayor, who also loves people to her credit, but he rarely agrees with, said about him that he is a man that cares deeply about people, that he knows everyone. He's the one justice that knows everyone in the building's name, and that he cares deeply about the institution.
And you've got to wonder what goes through his head, because it seems like such a thankless job. That goes to show what's truly, in my opinion, in his heart, that he's willing to do these things when, let's face it, the media and authors and lecturers aren't giving him any credit whatsoever.
Yeah, and a perfect example of that is one of the cases in the book, Kathy McKee versus Bill Cosby, someone your viewers might have heard about. And she sued Bill Cosby because when she accused him of rape, his lawyers and he degraded her in the public, and she just wanted to prove she was telling the truth.
Right.
A case called New York Times v. Sullivan. In fact, just yesterday, Justice Thomas pointed this out again and cited Kathy McKee's case. Justice Thomas was the only one that wanted to at the time, or at least the only one that wrote, I should say, that he wanted to revisit this case called New York Times v. Sullivan. What New York Times v. Sullivan was a case out of the 60s that was well-intentioned to protect the New York Times basically from the Klan and them suing the Times about lying. But what it did, and Justice Thomas pointed out, when you get away from the original meaning in this McKee case, what it did is it had unintended consequences. It meant that when you accuse a public figure of rape, you too become a public figure, and thus basically, as to quote Justice Thomas, it's almost impossible to sue.
Okay.
And this is where Kathy McKee found herself. So Justice Thomas wrote in her case why they should revisit New York Times v. Sullivan. But here's the thing about Justice Thomas. He doesn't forget the real people. 2 years later, in an unrelated case, he mentioned Kathy McKee. And he said, this doctrine has gotten so warped, and I'm paraphrasing, that now by accusing a powerful man of rape, you can no longer bring a lawsuit. And then, just yesterday, he cited the case again.
Wow. Do you think it's his background that led him to be such a caring man?
Yes, I think growing up in such difficult circumstances, he literally slept on a dirt floor growing up. His grandfather spent all his money he could save sending him to Catholic schools, as I mentioned, and he just learned that, think about this, he grew up literally dirt poor.
Right.
I mean, we talk about dirt poor, but he literally was.
But by definition, he was dirt poor.
And he has risen all the way to the highest court in the land.
Right.
And he is very grateful to the American people for that. Only in America can you rise from that level to the Supreme Court or be the child of immigrants. My dad speaks English as a second language, came here with a one-way ticket and a $5 bill because he too grew up dirt poor. He was raised by a single mom because his dad passed at 2 years old in India at the time. That was very difficult.
Right.
And came to this country, and I saw him get naturalized. Right? I was there at the ceremony. Now, I've been appointed by presidents to 3 different positions: U.S. Attorney, District Court, circuit court. I perform naturalization ceremonies. I mean, is this the greatest country in the world or what?
What perfect full circle, just perfect.
Yeah.
And that's why I think for fans of Clarence Thomas like myself and some that are watching, it's so just purely frustrating to see the media's coverage of him, because he should really be up on a pedestal to be someone to look up to, not degraded.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that's right. I think he's an American hero. And if I can tell maybe one more
Of course,
story about
I can do all day if you want. I love these.
one more case that is Suzette Kilo. The first case in the book, I'm going to summarize for your readers, and hopefully they'll still read the chapter because it's got a lot of fascinating details. But Suzette Kilo was down on her luck. She was getting separated from her husband. She was looking for a house. And she found a house in New London, Connecticut. It was run down. She was a paramedic. It's all she could afford. But she had one requirement, that it have a view of the water. That's all she wanted. So it had a view of the river. And it was in a blue-collar neighborhood. It was the one house she found that was pretty run down and she could afford. She got a second job. She took correspondence courses to get a second job as a nurse so she could afford to repair her house. And through blood, sweat, and tears, she made her house beautiful. In fact, she thought, this is the perfect house. So much so, she loved it so much so that she painted it her favorite color, Odessa pink. And Frank, you're not going to believe it. I got a picture in the book, and it actually looks beautiful.
Okay.
And she she had a sign painted that said the Kilo House, and she put it on the house. And she was just living her best life, right? Enjoying living in this wonderful blue-collar neighborhood. Her neighbors, the Dairys, had lived there 100 years, their family. And when their kids got married, they put a down payment for them on a house in this neighborhood.
Wow. Yeah.
So people love this neighborhood. Well, what they didn't know is trouble was brewing. And there was a corporation your viewers may have heard of. They're called Pfizer, I think.
Yeah.
And New London was recruiting them to come to an old mill site in New London, Connecticut. But in order to come, Pfizer and New London cut a deal. Pfizer not only wanted to build a plant and office building for what they believed was their new wonder drug, Viagra, but they also wanted the blue-collar neighborhood leveled and put an upscale mall there, an upscale apartment building like condos, beautiful condos overlooking the river, and restaurants and stores. And so the only way they could do it in their mind was to wipe out this blue-collar neighborhood. So they teamed up with New London to use something called eminent domain. And eminent domain is when the government takes your property for, I'm quoting the Fifth Amendment, public use with just compensation. What does that usually mean? It usually means, as Justice Thomas recounts, that they would widen the road, so they'd take a sliver of the front of your yard, or they'd want to put sidewalks in a neighborhood, so they would take a portion of your yard to put sidewalks. The key being they're for a public use. Well, when Pfizer wants to take it, Suzette and her neighbors fight. And they fight tooth and nail. They get a law firm called the Institute for Justice that have made their name in eminent domain cases. And I think your readers will be interested, or your viewers will be interested in how. It's in the book. I'm going to skip that part. I'm skipping a lot, so I promise the chapter is still worth a read, but I'm going to skip to the end because time is limited. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Yeah. And at the Supreme Court, Suzette Kilo and her neighbors lose. Justice O'Connor writes the principal dissent, joined by Justices Scalia, Rehnquist, and Thomas. Justice Thomas writes separate. And he gives everyone a history lesson as to why the Supreme Court no longer used the words of the Constitution, public use, but rather used the words public purpose. And he says this public purpose is suspiciously agreeable to the Pfizer Corporation.
Sure
Remember, his critics say he's in favor of corporations.
Right.
But this doesn't sound too in favor of corporations. Not only does he point that out, he points out where public purpose came from. It came from a 1950s case known as Berman out of the District of Columbia, where the Supreme Court transposed the words public use into public purpose to allow D.C. to take a neighborhood away to build a mall and other things. And what he pointed out is that this displacement of individuals resulted in 97% of the people being displaced being black. And he pointed out historically eminent domain was derogatorily referred to, and I'm sorry for saying this, but as Negro removal. That's the terms the politicians use.
Wow.
The only organization that asked for him to return to the original meaning, because the Institute for Justice thought they couldn't get 5 votes. They were obviously right, because even with public purpose, their argument was this isn't a public purpose, this is Pfizer's purpose, so it can't be for the public benefit. The only organization that I could find in the amicus briefs that asked Justice Thomas to return to the original meaning, the NAACP. Now, I'm going to challenge your viewers to go Google and find all the media accounts reporting that Justice Thomas was championing the view of the NAACP, because you won't.
You're not going to see that anymore.
So
what a great. Well, no, I want to hear more about it, but it's just amazing. I'm like in awe listening to this because it is so opposite of what we've heard for decades.
Yeah, and I don't know that you want to hear more about it, because let me give you the ultimate kick in the gut.
Yeah.
So the neighborhood gets leveled. Pfizer Corporation moves in. 8 years later, they leave.
Unbelievable.
And I just went there, and in the book, I took a picture. I put it in the book of a barren field that is where this neighborhood was today. So remember, this case was decided in 2003, I believe, early 2000s.
Wow.
20 years later, that field is where her house once stood, where the Dairies house once stood. And when you read the chapter, you're going to see all the drama. One point where they're sleeping in a house because they're worried the city will plow it, will knock it down before a court has given an opportunity to rule.
Wow.
I mean, the drama in this chapter, it'll keep the readers up at night, unfortunately, because of what they now know is the punchline, that Pfizer left, Suzette Kelo and the Dairies houses are gone, and when they read the words of Justice Thomas, they're going to be blown away.
A thriving neighborhood. That's such an amazing story. So how much research went in this book? Because like you said, you went and visited. This must have taken you quite a while to write.
Yeah, it took over 1.5 to 2 years to figure out what cases to write about. One thing I wanted to do is every case in this book has a separate writing by Justice Thomas. Why? Many people consider him the ultimate originalist. I wanted the readers to get a true feeling of what, as I say, Justice Thomas's America would look like. The best way to do that is get his separate writings where he doesn't have to compromise, where he writes what he believes. And I think your viewers obviously will appreciate Justice Thomas's America when they read this book. I think even the critics would be surprised if they would give it an honest read.
Because I wonder sometimes if the critics actually know why they feel the way that they do in the media. It's almost because they've had so much propaganda thrown at them that they have to toe the party line.
Yeah, I wish they would read his words. Everything I found, it's so rare, and that's the beauty of the People's Justice, the book, is in the People's Justice. I recount the stories by interviewing the participants, exhaustively studying the court records and other things, and the lawyers, everyone else, but then so that you, the reader, can live alongside the litigant. You can live through their pain, you can live through their drama. It's written for everyday Americans. I'm not trying to write it in legalese. I write it in plain English.
Good.
The one thing I do is I try to quote Justice Thomas when it matters. So you, the reader, can decide whose side he's on.
Right.
Is he favoring the big guy or a little guy?
Right.
'Cause you're gonna be surprised.
Well, I know you've got me hooked, so right as we go, where's the best place to buy the book?
You can get it everywhere these days. It's on Amazon, but it's also available in your local Barnes & Noble or other bookstore. And if you get it and read it, I'd love to get feedback, but I think you're really going to enjoy it. The stories are amazing. You're going to laugh, you're going to cry, and you're going to love Justice Thomas. Those are the 3 things I probably could promise will happen.
Well, if people aren't hooked, I don't care if you like Justice Thomas or don't. I think this is a book to get, now to learn.
Yeah, and I think you're going to learn a lot about history, because I included a lot of history that's fun, like about West Point. You're going to learn a lot about the Constitution, and you're going to learn a lot about Justice Thomas as a person and a jurist.
Judge, thank you so much for giving us so much time this morning.
Thank you for having me.
I can't wait to read the book. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox, broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio. I'd like to thank the Honorable Amul Thapar, the author of that book, The People's Justice. I thought that was a fascinating interview, learning more about the man, Clarence Thomas. And we've seen the media coverage of Clarence Thomas. I'm actually going to ask our guest tomorrow, who is Robert J. Delahunty. He's the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court. We're going to talk to him about the media's coverage, things like the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing, and many other topics. So you want to tune in for that. That'll be right around 7:10, 7:15. I want to mention a local issue before we get into some bigger topics. This coming from our Congressman Nick Langworthy, because yesterday it was announced that more than $33 million in federal funding for the public health programs in our area. There's a quote by the congressman: "By investing in local manufacturing and educational programs, we are strengthening the well-being of our communities and the future of the Southern Tier. This funding will continue the local manufacturing of essential components for national infectious disease monitoring and will expand access to high-quality early childhood education, ensuring that children and families have the support they need to thrive." And this coming specifically, the grant going to Corning Incorporated. They've been awarded $29,838,136, and that's for advancing and producing high-quality pharmaceutical glass tubing and vials. This funding will enable Corning to create and maintain industrial base capabilities essential for national defense, and that's with the infectious disease surveillance networks, and an additional $3,680,000 for Head Start programs in Elmira, the Economic Opportunity Program in Elmira. So there we go. Wanted to mention that from the congressman. We hadn't heard from him in a little while. I think I got a problem with my email. I wasn't getting his press releases, so we're back on. I wanted to mention that to you. We have a second here. We're going to talk about, when we come back, some federal issues, not so much local. Maybe we have a couple local things left to get to. If you would like to weigh in on anything we discussed or talk about the interview that we just had with the Honorable Amul Thapar, I'd love to hear from you. That's the best way to reach out to me. Questions, comments, concern, criticism, or if you have any suggestions for interviews, or if you'd like to be a part of the program because you're a part of a charitable organization or you're running for office, please. I'd love to hear from you. All right, let's take that short break. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We are back here with Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV, Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom. This is a kind of an interesting look into the backroom dealing in politics. Hakeem Jeffries is staging a takeover of the New York Democrat Party, essentially. If you follow this, it really should be Governor Hochul's position, but Governor Hochul ran a pretty poor campaign herself for governor, not focusing on public safety. That's why Zeldin did so well, because he did focus on public safety. And many, because of the success of Lee Zeldin, many believe, myself included, that that's why Republicans won so many seats in New York in the House, because Lee Zeldin was out campaigning, just hitting the ground. So he helped push those Republicans over the finish line. And that's why we ultimately, as Republicans, have the majority in the House. So Jeffries, apparently not happy with Governor Hochul, or maybe positioning himself because he wants to be Speaker of the House. Now minority leader, he wants to be Speaker of the House. So he's saying, well, to get there, we have to get some more Democrat wins. So let me micromanage. Let me take this over. Hakeem Jeffries, according to CNN, his path to winning the majority and becoming Speaker runs through his backyard in New York, and he is methodically staging a takeover of Democratic House campaigns in the state to make it happen. Jeffries is installing his own loyalists in key positions as he effectively takes over much of the state party operations that would usually be controlled by Governor Kathy Hochul. This is a little bit, this would be interesting to be a fly on the wall of these discussions, because Governor Hochul, she says, I focus on this all day, every day. This is my biggest thought. Some quote like that we've got to win these seats and I'm going to be in charge. But Hakeem Jeffries saying too little too late, essentially. Now it says New Yorkers always think, this is from CNN, I guess you can throw a little bit of a bias in here. New Yorkers always think of themselves as the center of the universe. Wow, okay. In the battle for control of the House next year, they sort of will be. This is considered reporting. Democrats need 5 seats to get the majority in the U.S. House in 2024, and there are currently 6 Republican freshmen who won last year in Democrat-leaning districts of New York. New York, Hakeem Jeffries said, will play an important and outsized role in the outcome of the 2024 House elections, period, full stop. Okay, I don't think Hochul did a good job, but I think a congressman who wants to take over the party that ends his sentence with period, full stop, well, I'll let you be the judge of that. If that's someone you want helping your campaign, maybe do some more hipster cliche stuff to put your candidates over the finish line. All right, we got to take another short break. Stay with us. We've got a few other things in this vein when we come back. This is Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV, Big Fox. And we're back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Now, do you recall during the debt ceiling debate, you could see Biden setting up, and Democrats in general and the media, setting up the narrative that if the government shuts down, that every economic issue we're now currently facing and been facing for the last few years the blame would be put on Republicans. Well, of course, Republicans played it, well, however you think. A lot of people are saying McCarthy played it brilliantly. Everything, yes, we would have liked to see more, but when it comes to negotiations and when you only have the House, we did pretty darn good. And a lot of Democrats are critical of Biden and their own party on how much they lost. But they didn't have the opportunity to lay the blame on Republicans like they had, I think President Biden had hoped for coming into an election. But listen to how this article puts federal debt. We know federal debt's going to soar. Biden and the Democrats have been spending out of control for years now. But according to the Washington Post, federal debt is to soar, CBO predicts, despite the GOP-led spending standoff. Wow. Okay, so we get our way once, and not even completely our way, and that was supposed to fix the problem, according to the Washington Post. No, that headline is so misleading. We never said, as a party, that it was going to fix the problem. We're trying to rein in spending. The U.S. debt is expected to soar to historic levels over the next 30 years, eventually reaching 181% of the country's total economic output. 181%. That's, you can name so many of the bills. Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure, all these things that Biden pushed forward that are just exorbitant amount of cost. It's not sustainable. That's why we're dealing with inflation. That's why we're always complaining about the cost of goods and services. But listen, and I'm going to start that sentence over, and we do have to take a break here in just a second. But the U.S. debt is expected to soar to historic levels over the next 30 years, eventually reaching 181% of the country's total economic output, even after Republicans drove a high-stakes standoff this spring to secure what they described as a major improvement in the nation's fiscal health. What's an improvement? It wasn't a fix. And if you look at some of the things that were proposed that we would have actually liked to get through, the original legislation that was passed in the House, it would have made a much bigger dent. So you've got a man who's been spending outrageously for, 3 years now? And House Democrats at one point, before they lost the majority, the Senate, just spending out of control. And the Republicans trying to rein that in, doing the best they can, only having the House. And they still put the blame on Republicans, even after that high-stakes standoff, is what they call a major improvement. So none of the blame, I guess, on the outlandish spending by Democrats that have really, really hurt the economy. They won't say recession. We'll say it. That's the media. That's why I focus on the media so often, folks, because of their bias, because of the way they can spin it. And those are talking points that you'll see from the Democratic Party, whether or not they got it from the Democrats or the media provided it to the Democrats. You will see that talking point frequently, and that's why I wanted to mention it. It got me a little upset this morning. We're going to take a short break. Stay with us, then we're going to wrap things up here on the Thursday edition of Frankly Speaking. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom. We are broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio here on Marcus Street in Corning. There's been a lot of talks in the news about, I don't know if you want to call it this breaking story. On Monday, President Biden had something on his face, like it looked like creases or something to that extent. It turns out that he's begun using a CPAP machine for sleep apnea. Coming from CNN, Biden, who is at 80, the nation's oldest president, has had a history of sleep apnea in the past. Okay, it did not come up in his physical that was released not that long ago. Also, and I thought this was interesting on a kind of a related note, if you will, coming from Yahoo, Brian Metzger says that Biden has confused Iraq for Ukraine twice in the last 24 hours. Now, I don't know when this actually came out, so let's say the last 48 hours. On Wednesday, Biden spoke with a group of reporters outside the White House before departing for Chicago. He said it's hard to tell when asked the question, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. It was a question about Putin. He is losing the war at home, and he's become a bit of a pariah around the world. And on Tuesday night, at a fundraiser in Chevy Chase, Maryland, he referred to Ukraine as Iraq when touting the unity of NATO. Quote, "If anybody told you, and my staff wasn't so sure either, that we'd be able to bring all of Europe together in the onslaught on Iraq and get NATO to be completely united, I think they would have told you it's not likely. The one thing Putin counted on was being able to split NATO." It's just interesting because we know there's been several polls that show overwhelmingly Democrats don't want Biden to be the nominee, that he's not capable or up to the job. And I don't say this lightly or in any kind of humorous way. It's just painting a larger picture of what next November is going to look like and what the lead up to next November could look like. There's a lot, and there has been a lot of articles about, is Gavin Newsom going to try to move on in there? It's something to think about, and I'm sure it's something we're going to be talking about a lot in the future. But not today, because we are out of time for Frankly Speaking. Thank you to our guest, the Honorable Amul Thapar. He's the author of the new book, The People's Justice, Clarence Thomas and the Constitutional Stories That Define Him. And as I said, we're having a couple back-to-back Supreme Court interviews. So on tomorrow's program, Robert J. Delahunty. He's the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court. So make sure you tune in tomorrow, starting at 7. This has been Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV Big Fox. Have a great day, everyone.